Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 ICRRA Conference, Culture in Security, International Cultural Relations as an Enabler of Peace through Engagement. We are delighted to have you with us for this session, which is the first of 5 online sessions through which we are exploring the contribution of arts, culture, education, and civil society to peace and security, and thinking in particular about the role of international cultural relations programs can play in that. And we are also delighted that our conference was selected to be an official site event of the UNESCO Mondial called 2022 World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development, which gets underway in Mexico City later this week. I am Venka Purushothaman, Provost at Lasalle College of the Arts, Singapore, and an ICRRA member, and I'll be chairing the session today. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just want to say a few words to frame how the session fits into the overall program of the conference and its wider aims and objectives, and to highlight some of the key themes that we might be able to pick up in our discussion later on. Before I do that, just a bit more background and context for you. For those who are not familiar with ICRRA, it stands for the International Cultural Relations Research Alliance. We are a network of academics and practitioners from around the world, convened by IFA, the Institute for Auslandsbeziehungen of Germany and the British Council. We are drawn together by a common interest in sharing knowledge from research and practice in international cultural relations. That is, knowledge about various engagements and interactions that occur between countries, communities, cultures, and peoples across the fields of culture, education, arts, civil society, heritage, and so on, outside of formal diplomatic channels or official state structures. We are also committed to making our network truly global, one that is inclusive and representative of expertise and perspectives from around the world, including the Global South. Hopefully, that is something that you see reflected in the program for this conference. On our website, you can find more information and videos from our past conferences. So what are we aiming to do with this year's conference is to create a better understanding of how and why culture broadly understood needs to be at the heart of global efforts to build more peaceful, secure, and inclusive societies, a key requirement for sustainable development. We are focusing in particular here on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and more specifically SDG 16. We are promoting and arguing for, in effect, a more holistic understanding of peace and security, one that acknowledges and embraces the role of culture in providing spaces for encounters, learning, social cohesion, as well as inclusive relationship building, exactly the kind of social practices that are at the heart of sustainable, peaceful group formation. And we will also ask in particular how and why international cooperation in this field can be supportive for these objectives. So this conference is about culture, and it's also about international cultural relations. That is, programs, projects, initiatives, and encounters that bring people of different backgrounds, countries, and communities together through and around culture. We want to understand how these relationships work in practice in different cultural and political contexts worldwide. And we are asking where and how this has the potential to foster a more holistic approach to peace and security that we think is needed. With Mondial in mind, we hope to draw on all of this to provide actionable recommendations for UNESCO and its stakeholders that can help to re-energize delivering SDG 16 over the coming years until the end of the decade, the target date of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So that is the overarching scope for this conference. And we have given ourselves an ambitious task, and we are glad to have you on board. So on to today's session, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Paul Cooke. Paul is a Centenary Chair of World Cinemas at the University of Leeds and specializes in the politics of representation and voices in world cinemas. He's the director of the Center for World Cinemas and Digital Cultures. Over the last few years, he has run a number of participatory filmmaking projects supporting young people to explore the legacy of difficult pasts. He is currently the principal investigator of the AHRC GCRF Network Plus project, Changing the Story, something that we will be hearing much more later on. This is a project that spans over 12 countries and looks at ways in which heritage and arts organizations support young people to help shape civil society in post-conflict settings. He's director of the award-winning film Born Free Generation and numerous others. Recent publications include participatory arts in international development with Rob Stone, Stephanie Dennison, and Alex Marlowe-Mann. He has numerous other publications, and really, we are truly delighted to have Professor Paul Cooke on board. So before I welcome Professor Cooke to speak, please kindly all note that the keynote is 45 minutes, followed by question and answers. We encourage audience members to post questions in the chat as we go along. Please note that this session is being recorded and that recordings will be made available on IFA website and YouTube channels thereafter. So without further ado, Professor Paul Cooke, please.
Thanks very much, Venka. Thanks for such a lovely introduction. And I just want to say it's a great honor to have been asked to speak at this conference. And from your introduction, from the way you framed the event, I can kind of see why. So there is obviously great synergies between what you guys are doing and what we've been doing, particularly in changing the story. So as Venka says, my name is Paul Cooke. I'm a professor of world cinemas, but over the last 10 years, I've mainly been focused on using primarily my own personal practice, using filmmaking, but working on projects that use a whole range of different arts practices to support particularly young people to help amplify their voice to advocate for change in a range of contexts. Okay, and Change the Story is probably the biggest project that I've run to date. It's an AHRC, or an Arts and Human Council, and Global Challenges Research Fund supported project, looking, as we say, at how young people can be supported to build inclusive civil societies in post-conflict settings. And it's primarily focused at looking at how youth-led development can be made most effective. And that's the kind of key theme that I think I'm going to talk about today. Okay, let's see if I can now make the technology work. Right. So the project aim is to evaluate, present and inform the practice of civil society organizations working with young people in post-conflict settings in order to build strong institutions that sustained social justice. So in some ways, what we've done is a paraphrase of SDG 16. It's about helping to use youth-led grassroots initiatives to build stronger institutions. And that's been the key endeavor over the last 4 or 5 years as we've been running Changing the Story. So why young people? Well, you know, basically, unless we focus specifically on young people, there is no chance on earth that we're going to hit the SDG targets by 2030. Currently, 90% of youth living in developing countries 90% of youth live in developing countries, and 500 million live on less than $2 a day. The youth population of the poorest countries is projected to be to increase to 62% by 2050, and young people are the most affected by many of the global challenges. Rising rates of unemployment, obviously, and there's a real feel that their voices are not being, you know, they're certainly not being listened to, and there's sort of, you know, there's a tendency towards disengagement, and that's for all the sense that we also have of young people protesting against climate change and all this sort of stuff. If you look at the overall stats, it's a real sense. There's a real sense that of global disengagement of young people, and post-COVID, those fears are being exacerbated. So there's a real imperative to focus on youth-led initiatives and youth-centered approaches to development. Okay, and why look at kind of arts-based practices? Well, this is, for me, this was really interesting because there's a huge amount of what you might call anecdotal evidence about the value of this stuff. Accepts there is a value. You know, quotes like this are kind of very, very common. This is a quotation by a guy called Ogi Tomek, who is now an award-winning filmmaker, but grew up in Sarajevo in the aftermath of the war there, and was supported by one of our partners, Hope and Homes for Children. And talking to Ogi, he said, being trusted with a camera changed everything for me. Yeah, so this is the moment really where he began his filmmaking career. And it all happened through a participatory arts-based project being supported by Hope and Homes for Children in the early 1990s. And this kind of, you know, transformative potential of the arts is, everybody talks about this, but when you actually looked in detail, it was pretty clear that there wasn't much kind of what kind of, you know, statisticians, etc., would call robust evidence. So what we wanted to try and do was really kind of drill down into arts-based practices in post-conflict settings and see if we could kind of really draw out sort of the active ingredients of this kind of work, and to see what worked, what didn't necessarily work, in order to try people kind of going down blind alleys, etc., our organizations to connect and network and reflect on their practice. And obviously, as lots of colleagues here will know, that's really difficult. It's really difficult for a number of reasons, for small organizations particularly, who are very focused on delivering the services to their end users. For those organizations, to try to create space for reflection is a real challenge. And it's a real challenge as well because of the nature of the funding. Often development funding doesn't, or people's perception of development funding certainly, doesn't really allow much space for experimentation, right? You know, it's kind of, you've got to show that you delivered everything you did plus 10% in order for you to be able to get the next tranche of money. And what was the opportunity with changing the story, and with GCRF funding in particular, is that this wasn't development money. This was research money being used to support development projects. And that was kind of good and bad, and I'll talk about that wrong. But what it did do was create a space for experimentation and reflection, because the funder wasn't necessarily interested in the development outcomes. The funder was interested in the research outcomes. So, you know, negative results were still results, kind of thing, right? So there was an opportunity there to create a space for organizations to network and to reflect on their practice. Well, that was the theory, at least. Okay. So what did this mean in practice? Well, the idea was to support civil society organizations to reflect on and share practice in new ways. Because it was very much an arts and humanities approach, we were very conscious of trying to have a kind of broad, situated approach to looking at these projects. So it wasn't necessarily about trying to create toolkits that you could apply everywhere. It was about understanding what the particular challenges in each particular context was, and what that told us about that context, and how we could kind of learn from a shared understanding of the different contexts within which we were working. Okay, and then also we were very focused on participatory and co-production approaches. We were very much focused on kind of looking at grassroots approaches to this and seeing what could be learned at different levels then from those approaches. Okay, so that's what the plan was. We started off working in 5 countries: Colombia, South Africa, Rwanda, Kosovo, and Cambodia. And we did kind of this, and out of that then developed a proof of concept project, trying to draw on what we saw as best practice in each individual context. That then led to a further call for another set of projects. These were all to be led by early career researchers, and they were quite small scale, but it was the idea of taking the principles that we got from those 5 contexts, coming up with some sort of broad questions that we wanted to have addressed, and then we put out a call for applications. And we funded another 11 applications in different countries, drawing on the learning from round 1. That then led to a further iteration of projects. We funded about another 6, I think, at that point. And these were larger projects, led by colleagues at a variety of career stages. And these were then, the idea being that this would be another kind of iteration of the project, drawing on the lessons of round 1 and round 2. Okay, so that led to about 20 odd projects that we funded of various sizes. After that, we then had a call for some consolidating learning projects, the idea being then to try to kind of aggregate the findings, find out what worked, what didn't work, draw together that learning from the different regions. We funded 5 consolidating learning projects. And then, so that was the kind of the academic side of it. And then alongside that, we were also really keen to build a network of partnerships, of academic and non-academic partnerships. So you can see that we ended up having about 170 collaborating partners across 15 countries, and that really is was one of the key aims of the project. So it's kind of very much a research project, but at the same time, it was very much about trying to create a network of academics and practitioners that could provide that reflection and support that lots of civil society organisations, particularly small-scale ones, often find very difficult to achieve. Okay, so that was the sort of structure of what we did, and with a whole range of kind of research outcomes emerged from this. The basic premise of all our projects is that they had to be kind of very strongly youth-led and increasingly youth-designed, and out of that, so there's sort of various strands of learning that have emerged. One of the really important ones was uncovering and amplifying hidden histories. So this is an image from a street art project in Zimbabwe, which focused on trying to bring the Tonga community into the national narrative, to make the national narrative more inclusive than it had been hitherto. Okay, so so that was very interesting. There's a graffiti side to this as well, which is very, very interesting. Another project in that strand was building trust for truth-telling amongst former child soldiers. This was an animated project led by Dr. Matt Child in El Rosario University. And what we did in this project was we worked with groups of former FARC child soldiers who were kind of like, 15, well, between 14 and 18 when they were recruited, and are now in their kind of 40s. And they worked with youngsters that were between 14 and 18 now, and they told their stories to these youngsters. The youngsters then developed animations to tell these stories, and turned the testimony from the child soldiers into kind of scripts that were then spoken by actors. And there's a whole range of them. There's of these films. I think they're very powerful. And one particularly interesting example was through the process of doing this, the project effectively uncovered a war crime in Colombia, where it was uncovered how the army had kind of knowingly attacked, or seemed to knowingly attack, a battalion of child soldiers, and we kind of developed a long form documentary about that called Operation Burn. And what I'd like now to do is actually play you the trailer from Operation Burn. It's about 2 minutes long. It's just to sort of warn you, it's a story of child soldiers, so it can be quite challenging. The trailer's not as challenging as the film, I guess, but just to warn you, if you'd rather not listen to or watch the trailer, please turn away, and the trailer will be finished in about 2 minutes, or more like 3 minutes probably by the time I figure out how to turn it on. Right, let me just see here. Oh, here it is. Right, okay, so I'm going to start playing the trailer now. I just check if I play it.
No, it's not moving.
Can you hear the sound?
Yes, we see it.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah. So apologies for that, but hopefully you got a gist of the kind of stuff that we were doing. But if you're interested, it's well worth a watch. Project now has developed into a second project, which is kind of citizen journalism project, where we use the animations to work with groups of young people in Colombia who are kind of sort of using the videos or clips from the videos to kind of as a creative stimulus to get young people thinking about the stories that they want to tell. And we've developed this sort of citizen journalism project where young people from across Colombia are developing their own films, stories about a whole range of different issues, and uploading them to this website, and it's been quite interesting actually. It's been picked up a lot by, so it's obviously a model that kind of really speaks to people. Okay, so there's a whole tranche of projects that we did about kind of uncovering histories and helping young people to develop for them to kind of find ways of creating more inclusive national narratives. Alongside that, another strand, part of much of the work, we've been really trying to think about what does youth voice mean, and thinking about the theorizing different forms of youth voice and how youth voice works within these projects, and how that needs to be embedded within a kind of broader ecology of institutions in order for voices to be heard and to be listened to. A big tranche of the project, and increasingly so as the power dynamic in the project shifted away from the global north. The starting point of this project was global northern funding, of course, UK funding, but over the 3 iterations, we tried to push the project to be ever more kind of led by colleagues across the global south. And at the heart of that then also was a kind of concomitant shift towards an emphasis on decolonizing knowledge. So it's very much about trying to look at kind of other epistemologies in order to challenge the way these kinds of projects run. And there were lots and lots of different examples of that, but this particular example, the tribal education methodology, was looking at that, was trying to decolonize knowledge in order to create a more effective state education program in Kerala, using arts-based practices as the starting point for the development of new educational curricula. Another big strand in the project was around youth leadership and youth entrepreneurship, looking at how these kinds of projects could be put into context with other organizations in order for whatever heritage kind of project was being developed, to see how it could be then used to stimulate tourism, or to kind of develop skills that could then be used in different contexts. So, for example, one of the projects I'll talk about in a little bit, South Africa, was a youth leadership project where we taught young people filmmaking skills. The main focus of that was to try to make films that raised awareness of issues that were important to the young people, so that they could kind of campaign for change within their community, but then also use the films to advocate for change with kind of local community leaders, kind of. But in the process, what was very interesting is those skills, we kind of got equipment for the kids and to use it, were then used in other contexts, so that so they would do things like shoot videos, or shoot kind of like local events, and earn some money from that. So that was then that kind of was a model that began to emerge. It's a kind of it's a pretty standard model, of course, where the project is embedded within a wider ecology or ecosystem of other organizations in order to try to make the projects more sustainable. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well later on. Okay. Another big strand was looking at how the work that we were doing could state education systems. I've already mentioned the example in India, but there are other examples in Kosovo and South Africa, in Rwanda, where our projects were being used to help to enhance the national curriculum. And this was kind of an interesting development in the project in terms of our engagement with policy. In lots of the areas that we were working, there was kind of a clear policy imperative for the arts to be at the center of the national curriculum. So, for example, in Rwanda, it's statutory that you have to have an hour's arts or creativity session in the curriculum, but there was very little resource or very little understanding of what that could look like. So our project there basically was about trying to put flesh on the bones of that policy imperative. Similar situation in Kosovo, where what you might call civics or civic education was an imperative, but there was a need for more materials to kind of have a more nuanced understanding of what you might mean, and our project fed into that curriculum. Okay, so that was sort of a number of ways in which we engaged with policy. Okay, and also, and we kind of always thought that this would happen, there was a huge amount of methodological innovation. So, you know, the project spent a lot of time thinking about participation, voice, whatever it was, kind of emerging from that at the moment around methodologies that are at the heart of these kinds of projects. So this was a research project. It wasn't a development project per se, but it was very much about trying to work in partnership with people that deliver development projects on the ground in order to try to affect social change. We strongly emphasize the need for equitable partnerships, right? So this wasn't about
Mr. Cooke.
Certainly didn't want to, yes?
Mr. Cooke, excuse me.
Hello.
Please switch off your video because it's hard to hear you because your connection is so weak. So if you don't use your video, you have better bandwidth for your audio.
Okay. Can you
Okay.
still see my? Will you be able to see my?
I switch off your video
slides?
now, and then you can talk
off.
on. Here we go.
Will you be able to see my slides if I turn the
Yes,
video
we see your
off?
slides. We see your slides.
Will you be? Can you see my slides? Still?
Yes, we see it.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Ob Sie mich,
Yes, we hear you,
ob
and
Sie
we
mich
can.
hören können?
Yes, we can hear you, and we see your slides.
Thank you very much. Right. So in the aim of the project then was to work in partnership to not only develop research innovation, but also to have a practical impact on the ground. So the aim of the project was to work at 3 levels, to support communities of young people, to support capacity building for civil society organizations operating on the ground, and then also to take that learning and to hopefully to support broader policy developments with INGOs and regional and national governments. So an example of this is a project that we ran in South Africa with the Bishop Simeon Trust, Hope and Homes for Children, the National Association of Childcare Workers, and the Department of Social Development, where the project was, we worked on the ground with a series of so-called safe parks. Safe parks are basically community centres for young people to offer wraparound care outside of school in very vulnerable environments. So what we did was develop a leadership programme via the arts, where we use the arts to support people to develop advocacy campaigns to affect change, to raise awareness of issues in their community important to them, and to support and to provide psychosocial support on the ground. Okay, in order, and so we were doing that for the young people on the ground, but the aim of doing that was also to support the sustainability of the civil society organizations that we were working with, the safe parks that we were working with, because there was a statutory requirement for those safe parks to have a youth leadership committee. Now, by and large, the only advice that those safe parks were given was you need to have a youth leadership committee. There was no support for how you develop one, what it might do, how it could benefit the kids, how it could benefit the safe park. And so what we did then was develop a program that provided those youth, that youth leadership committee. And by doing that, it allowed the safe parks to access statutory funding for their sort of sustainability. Okay, so the on-the-ground learning was then there to build capacity and support the sustainability of the organization that would be there to support the kids after we had left. Yeah, and then via that, we then also were able to inform and enhance national youth policy, because it transpired that the National Association of Childcare Workers, who responsibility for these safe parks, also didn't really have any strong sense of what a youth leadership committee could be. And so we were then able to develop their guidelines for that process. So that's the way we kind of try to work. We try to work from the ground up in order to support kids so that they would have, so what we did kind of supported them practically straight away. From that, we wanted the learning to be embedded in the organizations that we were working with, and through that to develop policy change. So that was the kind of key model that we tried to undertake. Okay, so that's what we're looking to do. And in the final part of this talk, what I want to do is talk about some of the challenges that we face, because I think that might be interesting in terms of a broader discussion with you guys about the nature of this work. Okay, so the first thing to say that the Global Challenges Research Fund was a very new development in the UK research funding space. Okay, it was both very positive, I think, but also very disruptive, because it was a very different type of funding, it seemed, to a lot of the funding that aid agencies and development programmers are used to. I've already sort of alluded to this, but quite often, you know, you would have a program, you apply for funding in order to continue to deliver that. Okay, and GCRF wasn't really about that at all. GCRF was research funding, so it's always going to be more focused on the innovation than the delivery of the program, and that's and for better or worse, right? And so that became kind of quite a challenge, because we were working with partners, and some of our partners would be very much kind of while we were applying for the funding, quite interested in the research side of it, but then when it actually came to the practical side of it, it was clear that that really wasn't the priority. Okay, so there was definitely, and it was kind of, it took a while for us to work, for us to understand that, and for everybody to kind of find their place in the ecology of our project, to understand what we were doing and what we weren't doing, because it wasn't the case that once we got to the end of the project, and if the project could show that they were really successful, that there was going to be more funding to continue that work, because this was a research project. Okay, but at the same time, it then did allow organizations to reflect, and from that you could definitely see that some of the organizations that we continued to work with throughout the whole of the project clearly were some of them were particularly innovation focused, were very interested in working with researchers and using it to kind of develop new research questions, etc. Okay, but also there was a real sense that with all the will in the world, in some organizations, the lack of capacity was that you couldn't really do much with this reflection. You might have, all right, so we've got this program set up, and the assessment is that we need to completely change it. Well, there just wasn't the capacity to do that, and if you were going to do that, then that would leave your fisheries exposed. So so there was, you couldn't really kind of make the most, I suppose, of the innovation that the research reflected. Okay, so what we found initially was that there was a real understanding that GCRF was there was a huge amount of funding up for grabs. This is where the funding wave had got to, and lots of the partners we were working with were very practiced at surfing the funding wave, but they found this particular wave quite different to some of the other funding pots that were available for them. There was a lot of freedom. You could change things in the middle of a project. You could kind of decide that what you're doing wasn't working, and there was no problem with that. There was a lot of freedom, but at the same time, the funding was only going to be there for a finite period of time. We were a project that worked, as we saw there, with 140 partners, and these partners ranged from big organizations. So one of our key partners was the British Council, that we did lots and lots of work with over the course of the project. And we also worked with very, very small organizations. In fact, in particular in Colombia, we worked with organizations that, they were very, very small micro community groups that, if you called them an organization, would be very, very suspicious. They were kind of, they rejected any sense of belonging to kind of some sort of civil society infrastructure. And so one of the real challenges for us was understanding the nature of that scale, and understanding that while an organization like the British Council, for example, would be very keen to work with some really small scale organizations to really understand what they could do that would be most effective, whilst the very small scale organizations had that knowledge, they were incredibly suspicious of bigger organizations, not least because they feel like in the past they had been co-opted by them. So one of the really big issues that we had throughout Changing the Story was building trust. And the projects that worked the best were by and large the projects that had started before Changing the Story and were likely to continue to work after changing the story. So, you know, the basic thing is with trust, you need to, you need time to develop it. But there was a very specific issue around scale, I think, in this context. Whilst, you know, large NGOs wanted to talk to small NGOs, because they knew that there was important knowledge in those organisations. The very small organisations were very often very suspicious of the agenda of the larger organisations. So we had that all the time in our project. Okay. Lots of this, obviously, is just down to power, right? So, you know, the project was very much focused on understanding the dynamics of power. Okay. All of our projects, all of our partners signed up to the youth-led development right from the start, but it was very clear that this was often easier said than done. And what we found actually in the projects, I think, is that, you know, sort of two findings. Finding one is that the more power you ceded to young people through the process of the project, the better the development outcomes of that project, right? That was without a doubt in all the contexts that we worked, that was definitely the case. So an example of that would also be the South African project that I discussed before, where over the course of the project, the CSO started to develop this child-parent self-reflection session, which was brilliant. It was kind of like, it was a way of, after every iteration of the leadership program and the materials that were made, they'd be used to kind of advocate for change with the mayor or whatever, but then they would also be played to the parents and guardians of the young people. And quite often there were some very difficult questions for the parents and guardians that would emerge from these films, and there would be then a discussion, and then through that process the young people would then set the agenda for the next iteration, and everybody has signed up to the fact that they had to go with what the young people wanted to deliver. So that was a sense that where we were really trying to make the projects accountable, not to the beneficiaries, not to the civil society organizations, but accountable to the young people themselves. Okay, and that worked pretty well in that project, and continues to work very well in that project, because everybody's kind of signed up to it. Okay, but it's very, very difficult to do that at kind of any kind of scale, of course. Yeah, because for lots of organizations, whilst you can say that, you know, fundamentally there's always going to be a fear of giving away power, and there's always talk about, you know, why you shouldn't do that because of safeguarding or whatever it might be. Okay, but at the heart of this, of course, is this sort of structural dysfunction that is at the heart of the aid industry, really. That you know, in most markets, if you buy a pair of shoes, you pay for a pair of shoes, and if you don't like the shoes, you don't go back to the shop, and you'll go somewhere else for the next pair of shoes. Okay, because the customer is the beneficiary. But of course, in the aid industry, it's not like that. Okay, the customer, if you like, are the donors, but the beneficiary are the aid recipients, and in the middle of that are the organisations that support them. So whilst they are all, you know, ostensibly have a responsibility to their recipients, clearly they have to be very wary of what the donors want. So you've got this kind of problematic relationship within the aid. GCRF was it allowed us to shift that a bit, certainly within particular projects where you could say, well, the donors are really happy for you to make the aid recipients be accountable to the aid recipients, because that's an interesting research finding, as it were. Yeah, so you could do that within individual projects, but of course structurally that's really, really hard to do. How do you get that kind of horizontal accountability, if you like, or downward accountability for the beneficiary? How do you make that horizontal? How do you make that kind of structural and work across different projects? And the only way you can do that, I think, is having a fundamental shift in the development ecology. Okay, and it has worked. You know, there have been examples of that, and the really famous one, of course, is the Zapatista movement in Mexico, where the communities basically refused to work with agencies unless they put in certain they had to follow certain rules. Like they had to make the young people, they had to make the community kind of, you know, drivers of the project. They had to make sure that the community actually got some of the money for this project, and they sort of set tariffs for all of this. And what was interesting is that when the sort of the age machine moved to the Zapatista communities, initially there everybody was there, all the big donors. But after time, as the Zapatista movement organized itself and would only work with organizations that would be accountable, lots of the big players, of course, moved out, and you were left with the kind of like, you know, the inner circle, sort of medium and small support, because basically the big organizations just couldn't do it. They just couldn't allow that level of control. And that basically, I think, is about talking for, but they're the main findings from changing the story. We've now got an archive because we've just finished. In fact, we finish Friday. This is the last day of the project. But there's a whole load of materials and stuff about the project on our website, Changing the Story at leeds.ac.uk. And if anybody would like to talk any more about this, please do get in touch. There is my email address. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that really, illuminating sharing and an impressive body of work with, communities in post-conflict zones. Really a wonderful initiative, and really, in many ways, it's not just merely changing the story, but changing perceptions and ways that in which we would have to engage with the world. We have currently about about half hour for question and answers. So I welcome audience members to type in their questions on the chat. If there are a couple of colleagues who would like to put up their hand and ask a question or two, you're welcome to definitely do that. So while we wait for questions to emerge, perhaps I'll start off with the first question. How do you envisage that we can link this ground experience with policy changes in the respective communities?
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of the Gordian knot, isn't it, Venka, of doing this stuff. So I think there's two responses to that. The first thing, where we've had the most traction, okay, in changing the story, has been very much where there has been a policy imperative set down. So you must have youth leadership, you must have create a creative session in your curriculum, and under-resourced schools or kind of organizations are left thinking, well, how do we do that? And then we take our kind of methodologies and work with schools and communities on the ground in order to try to kind of fill that gap and to develop answers to those questions. And that's certainly the approach that we've had in the approach that's worked in particularly, and also a little bit in Cambodia. So that's been the best way. That's been the most kind of effective way of doing it, I suppose. But then we've also had other forms of policy advocacy, not least trying to get people to actually think about young people as kind of not just as one thing that you kind of just have to solve the problem, but to think about young people as kind of intersectional beings that you have to kind of disaggregate from the data and think about the particular issues on themselves. And that's this sort of a broader approach, and trying to think about how arts-based practices can help with that. And fundamentally, we've had less success. I mean, we've had lots of warm words, and people are kind of, oh yeah, that's very good. Yes, young people are children of the future, blah blah blah. But it doesn't, I mean, maybe it's a longer burn. Maybe one set of projects can't do much there. But where we've had the most traction has definitely been about helping practically to deliver a policy imperative.
Thank you very much, Paul. We've got Nirmala who's got her hand up. So perhaps she would like to ask her question.
Yes. Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you, organizer. It was wonderful presentation. Congratulations. I am very much moved because of your presentation. We are doing similar kind of work in Nepal. And my question is for the sustainability and participation from inclusiveness in terms of gender, how you incorporate male and females in these youth-led programs, and how it is it successful or from both, I mean, sex. And another thing is after project completion, because it is the time bounding and resource bound, do you able to transfer these skill to local people? Can they run without project, or can they take this as a mission, or whom you connect? There are many stakeholders, not only the NGOs. So simultaneously other stakeholders, are they willing to participate in this I mean mission? Just want to know about this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Namala. And I hope life in, are you in Kathmandu? Yeah, I hope life in Kathmandu is very good. We run a series of projects in Nepal, looking at antimicrobial resistance and developing community-led solutions to the misuse of antibiotics. So it's one of my favorite places in the world, to Nepal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. In answer to your question, the way we think about gender is obviously very contingent on the context within which we're doing it. So different societies, as you know very well, will have different approaches to the interactions particularly between boys and girls. There's always more, if you're working with younger people, there is more latitude and more space to have mixed groups and to try to kind of develop those kinds of approaches. But we always have to be very, you have to be sensitive to the context within which you're working. The actual practices themselves are very kind of, it's interesting. You sort of think things like filmmaking or acting or whatever, when we're working with young people, there doesn't seem to be any sense that boys are more interested in one type of activity, girls are more interested in the other activity. I certainly thought that might be something that would emerge from the project, but it really hasn't. It seems to be that kind of like, people are interested in different things. The one thing that we do have to be very careful about is that in mixed groups, girls being marginalized and boys talking more, and sort of, and that's definitely something that that we have identified and is being built into our safeguarding protocols to ensure that there is space, actively for young girls, particularly, to participate. One of the dominant themes that's emerged from a lot of the projects that we look at is gender-based violence. So in the sense that that's another way that we've engaged with kind of gender issues in the project. Now that's been something that has emerged, and emerged not least from the fact that girls are marginalized, or girls, sometimes the boys will talk over the girls, and then that will lead to a kind of focus on issues around misogyny or whatever it might be. But again, that it would be, I couldn't come up with a general statement of how we have done it as a project, because it's always been related to the particular context, and in some and because the topics that we have engaged with across the project are always driven by the community. Largely there will be kind of there will be kind of interactions between different national projects as a way of kind of trying to stimulate discussion, but fundamentally, in some contexts, this has been a really, and again in South Africa, this has been a massive theme because of all the stuff that's been going on about kind of like the way women have been in society, issues around kind of so-called sugar daddies or blessers. These were very, very live issues while we were in the project. So they were being talked about a lot, and out of that there was also then a challenge to kind of the behavior of boys, particularly towards girls in the particular area, in the particular communities that we were working with, right? So I'm not saying for one moment that the boys that we were working with were abusing the girls the girls that were in the project, but because the topic was there, it meant that we could talk about those things and start to say, well, hold it, why are you not letting Pamela talk? Well, you'll dominate. So that's kind of how that worked. The methodological approach there was because we're using this situated arts-based approach. We couldn't kind of sort of say, well, changing the stories approach to gender is X. We had certain values that we would live by, as it were, but the actual delivery of that had to be contingent on the context and make appropriate to the context, right? So that's the gender question. The second question is really about sustainability, I think, isn't it? Well, given the fact that we are you know, we're a research project, so the focus would be on research, finding and innovation. The way the projects were always set up meant that we were always working with organizations that were going to be there when we weren't there, right? So it was all about us adding value to an established ecology, yeah, and that didn't always work, but when it has worked, that's the only way that it's worked, right? So working with, so for example, in Nepal, we work with an organization called Herd International, who are a kind of public health NGO, and we've been running a schools project there, raising awareness of the issue of antimicrobial resistance and how that's kind of like, you know, becoming an ever bigger problem. And we've been doing a sort of grassroots health campaign there, which is running in schools now, around, or being trialed in schools around Kathmandu. And that's working in partnership with Herd International, because Herd International are always going to be there, and they've got very strong links to the Ministry of Health. So, you know, so they're sort of well plugged into an ecology. So we can work with them, support them to kind of create innovative new programs that will then be delivered after we leave. And that was always the model, okay? And the idea being that the macro experience of all the different projects then builds over time, so we can share learning, etc. But the delivery always has to be rooted in local agents. What was interesting was COVID, because COVID obviously was a massive problem for the projects, as it was for the rest of the planet. And a few things happened. So initially in COVID, you know, everything just shut down because people were more focused on making sure that kids were being fed than they were about making community level films or whatever it might be. But over time, what was interesting actually was that a lot of the kids that we were working with, you know, the projects were all happening in community centres. Those kids were now in homes and they were invisible. So these marginalised kids were even more marginalised, as it were, during the course of the project. And they had to, so our work, which had to become digital, was a way of making sure that those kids remained at least a little bit visible. So that was kind of important.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah,
and there's something else I was going to say, but I can't remember. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that. I think actually the point that you raised in the last bit actually ties in with a question that has actually come out, and there are a couple of questions have come on the chat. As in, what is the present barrier which negatively impacts working with children, young people, and their families, and do you see ways to overcome it?
So could you just read, what is the barrier?
Present barrier which negatively impacts working with children, young people, and their families, and do you see ways to overcome it?
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really important question. So, I mean, so from my experience, and when we're very focused on working with children and young people, I would say, well, there is no barrier if you set the project up right. Yeah, it's absolutely fine. However, there is a perception that working with young people is hard because there's all that safeguarding stuff, and there is all that safeguarding stuff that you've got to get right. It can be more expensive because you've got to have chaperones, but if you set the project up correctly, there isn't necessarily a barrier. Yeah, there's a lot of perceived barriers, but it does mean it can be more expensive. It can be trickier because of the kind of safeguarding issues, but it's absolutely necessary. It's really required, because otherwise we can't, like I said, we're not going to deliver the SDGs.
Yeah, were there any particular cultural barriers in participating in some of the projects and activities? While we wait for Paul to connect, I'd like to, thank for these really fabulous questions that are coming through on the chat. Some of them are pretty, deeply thought through questions. Can I suggest audiences to continue to type in your questions? We will most probably get Professor Cooke to actually give us written responses subsequently after the seminar. So please do not hesitate to type in more questions. Of course, if you have not taken down his contact details, you can definitely we can definitely share with that at the end of the session.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can definitely hear you. Yeah. Hi, Carla. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, it was. Is Paul back? No.
No, not yet.
Okay. I think he's attempting. I just wanted to say I thought it was a really interesting presentation. And I was very interested in knowing a little bit more about the challenges of using participatory methods. I don't know if Paul is able to hear us now. I don't want to be cutting his time.
Can you hear me? I don't know. No?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so in terms of the challenges of participatory methods, the key one that won't surprise anybody that's done it is time. You know, you never have enough time. Projects are always not, you never have enough length of time to do it. That's why it's really important that you build a strong ecosystem around the projects, and the projects are embedded within a wider network of organizations for there to be further iterations on it, because the participatory practice in and of itself is only ever going to kind of stimulate innovation, in my experience. Trying to do these things at scale is always very difficult, it seems to me. And you know, in some ways, that scalability is always seen as the sort of the key aim, but I'm not sure it is. I think that the key aim is to make sure that the learning is embedded, not the participation, as it were, or not the participatory project, as it were.
Thank you, Paul. You know, one of the earlier questions that came out from Matthew Kahn was, were there any unintended benefits in your consolidated learning approach, either on the recipients of the research outcomes, right, on either of the recipients of the research outcomes? Yeah. Did you all find something?
Yeah. In some ways, everything was unintended, I suppose. You know, so in terms of entrepreneurship, there was a lot of interesting stuff there. So I've already mentioned skills building, but in Venezuela, for example, one of the projects uncovered these beans. I mean, not magic beans, but these beans that were basically a form of indigenous crop that had largely fallen into kind of, you know, people weren't using them anymore, and they were using these imported beans. And the young people set up a kind of micro business in order to raise awareness of the beans, and like they're particularly resilient in this particular community.
Okay, we lost you there, Paul. Not to worry. Are you all right there? Can you hear us? Okay, we lost Paul again, right? There are really quite a number of questions around, you know, the future, and clearly, you know, and I think Anita writes about it quite beautifully in her question. If you know, audiences could, you know, look to the question. Is Anita around? No, right? Really about, you know, is it possible that communities and youth might, to some extent, depend on help? And if how much help is too much help, right? How much initiative is too much initiative? I mean, these are important questions, and how do we look at it, right? I think to the technical team, you know, so that, you know, we can actually get Professor Cooke to actually, you know, write out the questions and responses, write out responses to the question, because I think they are extremely rich in terms of cutting through the terrains around what, you know, cultural relationships mean between researchers and investigators and the communities that they are seeking to study and enable. And at the same time, are there, you know, intended or unintended consequences around them? Thirdly, there are questions around empowerment that are coming up quite strongly. Are we really empowering them, or are they, you know, communities primarily, you know, case studies, right, in some level, right? I think a key question is also connecting communities, how do these communities connect? And I think this came through in a number of thematics in the questions and also in Paul's responses or presentation, that ultimately in order for sustainable development to emerge, and this is one of my key takeaways from Paul's presentation, is the fact that we also need to make connections between cultures and communities so that there can be a shared learning emerging out of these communities from the conditions that they might necessarily be in play. Great. So Paul has typed out some responses to earlier questions. Paul, if you can see Avril's question. She wanted to specifically know what the role of your institution in the manner in which funding was organized, the flexibility in which it was structured, and the contingencies needed.
Can you by any chance hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because that's a really important question that I think would take me about half an hour to type out a response to, because it's the key question, Avril. So thank you so much for that. The role of the funding and the role of Leeds institution primarily was supposed to be as a distributive agent, as it were, right? So this was ODA money and was primarily to be used in ODA countries to support work.
Sorry, Paul, what is ODA?
Oh, sorry, Overseas Development Assistance. Apologies. Okay. Yeah, it's the UK's term. I think it's a UK term for the aid budget. Okay, so this was the idea being that this was primarily to be used in the countries themselves. However, institutions in the UK are subject to UK tax rules, so there's a huge amount of bureaucracy designed to do this, which makes shifting the power balance and making us into simply a distributing agent incredibly difficult. Over the course of 5 years, we found ways of doing this and found ways of sort of working around it so that we didn't present a small community-based organization with a 300-page book that they needed to fill in before we could give them $100, so we did manage to do that, but it was very challenging. And it was something that I don't think we ever completely got right. In terms of the point about multi-year funded programs to build strong ecosystems, you're absolutely right. And we were never able to do that. It was never going to be possible, given the fact that we knew that this project was relatively short term. So we always had to be plugged into existing ecosystems. Yeah. So it was always about trying to add value to what already existed. And for me, that was very important, because the funding that we were using, again, was aid funding, ODA funding. And this was funding that had basically been, not taken, but had been moved from straightforward, as it were, research aid funding so it was disruptive to the aid ecosystem in the UK because of that. So for me, it was very important that our funding added value to what was already going on.
But Avril, do you want to just follow up on the question that you had for Paul?
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting conversation that Paul's begun here with us, because it really goes to the heart of how we reconceptualize international cultural relations in such a way that it's truly fair, equitable, and that it's really building up capacity in the global South. And here, given that it's run by a university, the opportunity exists to then develop research capacity in the global South, in the countries that he's working with. So my follow-up question was, whether there was a possibility or a thought around thinking about a multi-institutional agreement in the funding arrangements, so that the funding is not just held by Leeds and then trying to be, establish relationships which are very difficult with very small organizations. And I just referenced a project we're doing at King's College London with 3 universities, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, where the funding is transferred to the local universities, who then not only build up research capacity amongst their masters and PhD students, because they get involved in the project, so you keep that research capacity in the local environment, but you also then are much more able to be agile in transferring small amounts of money to many small organizations. So I was just wondering whether that was a possibility in his project, and how he dealt with the very, as he said, there were many unintended consequences, many contingencies that need to be thought about, and often funding is incredibly formally structured, doesn't really allow for these projects to be truly fair. So I'm really enjoying what Paul's saying, and I'm so frustrated that his connection is weak. But, you know, that also makes me feel better from the Global South, because normally the connection is weak on our side and it's strong in you know, I would assume in Leeds it should be stronger. So anyway.
Yes, yes, indeed. Paul, are you connected now to say a few words?
I've hopefully typed an answer. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So Avril, I just want to say here, Avril. You know, we don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, and the fact that my computer, I'm in a Premier Inn in Scarborough in the UK, and I've got no internet connection. So there you go. You know, we don't have load shedding here, but that's going to come our way soon, I think, as well. So our project is basically set up in the way that you describe. So each of the sub-projects needed to be led by a local institution in partnership with the UK. So the idea was that we were trying to build equity into the kind of the DNA of the project. Yeah, but at the same time, you're right, the money started at Leeds, we distributed it, but the idea that we didn't control it, the money was then controlled by the local organizations. And what was interesting was COVID really helped with this, because nobody could travel. So what we did in changing the stories, we took our travel budget, which was very large, and we turned that all into local jobs, which I think within the ethos of equitable partnerships was really good, because it meant that it generated more work for colleagues locally, which was really good. But of course, you have to be careful that you deliver on that, because that can turn into a very colonial model, can't it? Of kind of like, you know, colleagues in the Global South doing the work, and then the research being written up by the Global North, and that's something that we are not interested in at all. And I hope that when you look at, if you look at our website, you'll see that that is not what is emerging. But I think it was very good, and for me, it's a model for how we do this in the future. That it's, you know, that mindset of thinking that you know, I have to go to Joburg all the time to work with people in the projects, you know, when we can do so much by Zoom, and we can generate more resources for colleagues there, where frankly the money goes further as well, you know, and you can do more with it. It's definitely the way forward. So I think you're absolutely right, Avril, and that's what we try to do in changing the story. But UK institutions, as you will know, I'm sure, from working with King's, often do not help you in this endeavour.
Thank you, Paul. And I think, you know, your response also nicely segues into an earlier question that someone asked about how we do not also fall into the Orientalist trap, right? In relation to the Global North and Global South. And Cesar actually asked this question around, you know, how is it possible to represent stories from countries in the Global South in justice and fairness without stereotyping and or stigmatizing people, histories, and events?
Yes, I mean, that really, in some ways, that's at the heart of what we were trying to do. And I think what's very interesting there is the issue of curation. So our project is called Changing the Story, and it was precisely about trying to allow colleagues, partners, participants in the communities where we were working to tell the stories or to raise the issues that are important to them. And the first time I did something like this, where we were showing some of the films, and again, it was part of our South Africa project, where we were showing the films that had been developed by the young people there to advocate. It was around gender-based violence, because there's a particular issue in this community, and so we were then kind of taking that, and then we'd done a series of screenings in Ekurhuleni on the outskirts of Johannesburg. And then we were trying to do a presentation in the UK, and it was precisely, the question was kind of like, well, what story are you changing? These are the stories that we expect to come from South Africa, you know. And that was interesting, interesting was kind of like, you realize that you have to be very careful about how you curate these stories and how community stories can mean different things the further away from the community that they are taken. And that's why, and picking up another one of the questions, that's why we also worked very hard to ensure that we are kind of the opposite of extractive in terms of what we do. So apologies if the way I've described it sort of suggests that we've got all these case studies. The case studies emerge from the work that we've done with communities, where the communities definitely own the material and drive the agenda, and the work has to be of use to them. Yeah, and any kind of research impetus that comes out of it is secondary to that. So we are driven by the refusal to have an extractive approach to this kind of work, and that's why I'm saying that by having more work going on in our local communities, that's really good because it generates more resource. But we have to be careful because that can look like a very extractive approach if you get that wrong.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think with that final point, I would like to invite you to make some final comments before we close the session.
Anything I would like to say is sorry.
Yes.
Sorry
yes,
for
that's right.
the internet. That's annoying. But it's yeah, because I'm sorry for that. But I'm also sorry because this was a very, very rich session, and I'm really pleased if anybody would like to continue the conversation. I've seen some email, some points there. Please do get in touch, and I'm really happy to kind of have further catch-ups or chats with anybody that would be interested.
Thank you very much, Paul. So on behalf of ICRRA 2022, I really would like to thank you for your wonderful presentation, extremely illuminating and really meaningful work in terms of creating impact in various communities, providing them a platform to give voice, and at the same time providing opportunities for cultures and communities to connect and work with each other. There's much to learn, and in terms of the robust questions that come through, clearly they fall within notions of what is ethically right, what is operationally prudent, and what is sustainable, right? In many ways, these come through it, but we are ultimately here as a community of researchers and academics and arts practitioners who are also trying to weave together the stories we want to tell about the future of how we relate to people. So thank you very much. We most probably will find an opportune time to invite you back again and perhaps have a conversation with ICRRA members, and really truly delightful. We will share your contact with all the participants. I must thank all the participants who came from around the world, and it was an impressive list of people from around the world who had attended today, and truly, thank you for kicking off, ICRRA 2022 conference with such great show, and clearly, the technological change is an interesting one because in many ways it is manifestly symbolic of the many challenges we have to continue to do with the various cultures that we engage with and the various communities we engage with, and we're continuously tripping while we are continuously seeking to communicate. So on that wonderful note, I thank everyone for your attendance. I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow at tomorrow's session at the ICRRA conference. So take care and have a good day, everyone.